What is history? So, I like to start off all of my history classes by raising some basic questions with respect to the discipline of history, more of a philosophical approach to get things started, but also in order to talk about what constitutes as like the basic evidence of history and how historians go about actually like doing history, writing history. Sorry, my dog's in the background making weird sounds if you can hear her. So I usually like to start off with a bit of discussion, asking this question: what is history, and why should we study history? Why does it matter? Why is it important? And I get a lot of different responses to this question: what is history? Typically speaking, these responses revolve around history being somehow related to the past, history being the study of the past, an approach to the past, history being a record of everything that has happened or the important things that have happened in the past. Or I'll oftentimes get kind of catchphrases that people have loosely associated with history. History is written by the victor. Those who do not remember the past are doomed to repeat it. And these are a good place to start, I think, because it helps us to understand what our kind of preconceived assumptions about history are, what we think history is. And it also highlights one of the fundamental features of history, which is that history is there to like teach us something, and also on the other hand that there's some sort of inherent bias with history. So I have a couple of quotes here by some historians that I think will help us walk through these questions. The first quote by Francisca Morphicus in the question, what is history? Francisca says that history is the study of people, actions, decisions, interactions, and behaviors. So what is history? One of the first clarifying points I want to make, and I actually had this discussion yesterday with my students when I asked what is history, and they said that history is literally a record of everything that happened in the past. So then we can ask some clarifying questions. Well, is it really the record or the story of everything? And one of the ways that we can narrow this down a little bit, but not a lot, is to say that history is focused primarily on human beings. There's a few caveats there, but if we look, for example, about the history of a species other than humans, if we're looking at the history of elephants, then we're not really doing history, we're doing biology. Or if we look at the history of, let's say, dinosaurs, if we're studying fossils, then we're not really doing history, we're doing paleontology, so on and so forth. So when we look at history, the primary subject of history is humans. Now we can ask, well, what exactly within the context of human beings are we studying? And this is where this definition is helpful. The study of people themselves. We can focus on individuals, such as famous people, presidents, leaders. We can talk about like the history of France through Napoleon. We could talk about the history of the Manhattan Project through people like Robert Oppenheimer, the people that worked on the project. Or if you look at books like A People's History, you can, if we have enough sources and documentation, we can kind of look at the quote unquote everyday folk who lived through these events and whose lives were shaped by the events to see what they had to say about the events. But history focuses on people, it focuses on those people's actions, what those people did, how they did it. Maybe we can even get a little bit into why they did it if we have like personal sources, the decisions that they make, how they interacted. Again, we could talk about this on an individual level. We can also talk about this on a national level. If we want to talk about the history of World War II, for example, we might look at things such as the relationship between the United States and Great Britain, or we might talk about the various military strategies of nations. We're kind of taking a big picture view of history when we take that approach. And then the last bit, focusing on people's behaviors, what they did, how they did it. And then again, maybe getting a little bit into why they did it. But as I pointed out in my class, although the focus is primarily on human beings, we can also take into consideration how non-human factors have influenced human history. That might sound like a weird thing to say, but if you look at something, for example, all of you who are watching this have lived through the COVID pandemic. So a historian might study the COVID pandemic and study the ways in which it impacted, influenced, and shaped culture, politics, society. You can even focus on how it impacted art, music, literature, whatever. There's a bunch of different lenses in which you can research and study the pandemic. And that's, of course, true of every historical pandemic. I mean, there's been a countless number of books written, for example, about the impact of the bubonic plague on Europe, or the impact of like yellow fever in the early settlements of the United States. I was just reading an article, for example, I live in the city of Savannah. Savannah was decimated by yellow fever throughout the 19th century. There's a couple of big instances of it happening, and you can kind of take that approach, kind of a environmental sort of history. You can also look at the history of geographic regions and talk about the ways in which geography has influenced culture, shaped politics, all that good stuff. So we have the focus of history, the focus primarily being on humans. I have another quote here that highlights another aspect of history. This is from Marcus Colla. History is fundamentally a problem-solving discipline. So with respect to the purpose of history, or what we should be doing when we approach history, oftentimes there's kind of this assumption that history is just recording what happened in the past, that you're kind of like this passive recorder and, taking notes and telling people what happened. But of course, that's not really what history is. It's not what historians do. And as a student of history, that's not really what as a teacher, that's not really what I'm trying to convey to students, right? And so I like this definition here because history presents us with several different problems. In the same way, if you're taking an algebra or a geometry class, you're going to be presented with some problems, and your teacher is going to ask you to solve those problems. Theoretically, what I like to do in my history class is to present the class with problems. Now, these problems are of a slightly different nature, but these problems revolve around those human interactions that we talked about in the previous definition. So we can ask, for example, like, why did the United States enter the Second World War? We're talking about like big picture history, or if you look at like the history of an individual figure. So I do a lot of, I guess, what would be considered like intellectual history. So I just wrote an article, for example, on the reception of general relativity in France in the early 20th century. So one of the historical problems there is, why was there resistance to the theory of relativity in France? And that's a problem. To answer that question, we're going to have to start digging deeper. Well, what was it about French science that's so resistant? And you start to recognize pattern and trends. Okay, French science was focused, had a primarily empirical bent to it. The emphasis was more so on experimental physics rather than theoretical physics. And the conclusions of Einstein, especially in his 1905 papers, was seen as purely theoretical and it didn't have an experimental basis. And so that's why it's not until the mid 1920s and early 1930s that people start to become more receptive, because it's then that we start to get a more experimental basis. So that would be an example of like a historical problem. And you can ask this of any aspect of history. You can ask it about military history. You could be as specific or as broad as you want. So you could say, for example, well, why did the Battle of Lexington and Concord turn out the way they did? Or you can go even broader and say, what was the political, cultural significance of the battles of Lexington and Concord? So history presents us with these problems in different ways. And when we approach history, we're kind of confronted with those problems of providing an explanation for these events and ultimately why these events matter within the context that we want to talk about them. But there's another problem that history presents us with, and this is more of a epistemological problem and not really like a subject area problem. So we're going to combine history and philosophy here, because one of the principal issues that we as philosophers are confronted with studying history is the problem of the past. How is it that we can know that anything happened in the past? How is it that we know the past? What are the ways in which historians justify their knowledge about the past? And this relates to a branch of philosophy known as epistemology. Now, epistemology, and I have a video, my introduction to philosophy video, provide a general outline of epistemology, but very broadly speaking, epistemology refers to theories of knowledge. How do we know what we know? And epistemology is a theory of knowledge, especially with regards to the method, validity, and the scope of our knowledge. I have here on the slide, epistemology is an investigation of what distinguishes, and this is the important part, justified belief from opinion. So one of the things I like to point out to my students is that we all have beliefs. We have beliefs about all sorts of things, right? I believe that my car is parked out in my driveway right now. I believe that the color of my wall is white. I believe that I'm going to have a job when I wake up tomorrow. I believe that I am a good person or whatever, right? We have beliefs about all sorts of things, material objects, ourselves, other people, ideas, and thoughts that we have. But what makes something a justified belief? Now, this is a very big problem within epistemology that I'm going to kind of skim over. But one of the criteria that I use to say that something is a justified belief is that a justified belief is a belief that we have evidence for, a belief that we have proof for. And this can even relate to things that are more subjective in their orientation. So one of the things I like to start off with is I give an example of, let's say I have a friend named Bill. And I might say, I believe that Bill is a good, trustworthy person. So the question, am I justified in that belief? What sort of evidence do I have to suggest that Bill is a good and trustworthy person? And we can think of what would constitute as evidence for that belief. I might say, well, I've been friends with Bill for 10 years. During that 10 years, anytime Bill has made a promise to me, he's always kept that promise. Anytime I needed help dog sitting, Bill was there to dog sit. Anytime I needed help moving from one house to another, Bill was always there to help me. I might also say something along the lines of, Bill has never betrayed me. Bill has never stabbed me in the back. Bill has never undermined our relationship in any serious way. And all of that kind of taken collectively together constitutes it justifies my belief that Bill is a good and trustworthy person. Now, where this starts to get tricky is when we start to say, when we take that criteria of justification and we shift it to a discipline like history. Well, what constitutes historical justification? How do historians know about the past, and can they be justified in those beliefs? And this is where we start to talk about, what constitutes evidence for a historical belief? So we have events which have happened throughout history, and take your pick about any one of these events. So the example I used in class was the Empire of Japan attacked the United States by bombing Pearl Harbor December 7th, 1941. So am I justified in believing that? Well, to answer that question, we have to look at what sort of evidence do we have for that attack, for that belief. And I can say, well, I have written evidence. There were people who were there that wrote about their experience there. I have oral testimony, eyewitness accounts of people who were there who recorded their experience. There's photographic evidence of the attack. There's the material remains of the attack. You can physically, I could go right now, book a plane ticket to Hawaii, which would be stupid expensive, go to Hawaii and look at some of the ships that were sunk. So yeah, there's actually, in the case of Pearl Harbor, because it's a more recent historical event, an overwhelming amount of evidence that I would be firmly justified in that belief. The further back in time we go, as I explained to my class, the trickier this sort of evidence can get, because what if we don't have written sources? A lot of history deals with documentation, deals with records. Is there any other way we can justify our beliefs about the past? Well, we can look at other things such as archaeological evidence. We can look at the biological remains of the people that we're studying. We can look at the skeletal remains. We can look at the places where they lived. We can look at the houses, the temples, the religious structures that they built. We can look at what sort of food they ate. We can look at how they domesticated their crops. All of this starts to paint a picture for us. All of this provides us with evidence and justifications about the sorts of claims that we want to make about these people. And this is where we start to shift from history as an academic discipline to historiography. So if history is the story of the past Historiography is the study of what we say about the past. It's the study of historical writing. And more importantly, within the context of this conversation, historiography tells us about the methods by which we study history. Now, historiography is a extraordinarily complicated subject, but how I like to break it down to its most basic part is I like to talk about this distinction between events or historical facts and narrative. But before we do that, I want to read you this quote from the historian E.H. Carr's book, What is History? This is a book that I had to read for my historical methodology class. Carr says that history consists of a corpus of ascertained facts. The facts are available to the historian in documents, inscriptions, all those different forms of evidence that we talked about, and so on. Like the fish in the fishmonger's slab, the historian collects them, takes them home, cooks and serves them in whatever style appeals to him. So this is where I like to bring up the quote that students will oftentimes mention, that history is written by the victors. And one of the things that this quote relays to people is that history is somehow inherently biased, and that when we read history, we are only getting a biased account of the past. And the reason why I like to bring up this quote and to relate it to what Carr is saying is because that bias starts to creep in, not necessarily with respect to the historical facts themselves, but really with respect to the narrative. So how I like to explain it, and feel free, I'm more than happy to talk about this in the comment section, is that historical facts, to use that word loosely, historical events, typically speaking, aren't what historians debate about. No one's debating whether or not Japan attacked the United States December 7th. No one's debating whether or not the United States entered World War II. And what I like to say to students is if somebody does want to debate you about something so basic, then at that point you're not really doing history anymore. That would be more of a philosophical conversation. If they're not willing to accept the level of evidence that we have for an event like the attack on Pearl Harbor, then we got to start talking about the nature of evidence itself, right? We got to go down to the very bare bones of what constitutes good reasoning. And we haven't reached the point of being able to talk about history or historical events, right? But here's where that quote and that saying that history is written by the victors starts to come into play. And where it starts to come into play is the narrative that's utilized. So the fish in this scenario would represent facts, but the facts in and of themselves don't really give us a whole lot. And yes, we have the facts available to us, but the job of the historian is to cook the fish, to make the fish edible. So we take those facts and we have to explain them or provide explanations for them. And here's where this nifty little chart that I created, it's a terrible example, but bear with me a little here. So we have the little stars, and these stars I say represent a historical fact or event, and then we have the arrow, which represents the narrative structure, the explanation that the historian's providing. So we have the fact, Japan attacked the United States at Pearl Harbor. Now we're adding the narrative. Okay, why did the Japanese attack Pearl Harbor? What was the political situation at the time in Japan that led them to the point where they felt like their only option was to launch a surprise attack against the United States? That would be one form of narrative. Another form of narrative would be talking about what the implications of this attack was. Why did it matter? Why is it important, historically speaking? All of that is what constitutes historical narrative. And it's the narrative part where we really start to see the bias, and it's the narrative part where historians really start to disagree with one another. Okay, so I hope that was helpful as a general introduction to what is history, to historical methodology, to historicity. Let me know if you have any further questions in the comments section, and I will see you all next time. Bye.